courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
A lot of shit to get to this week, and everything is going to be free this week. Don't care about the subscribers. There is a lot of chaos going on in our country right now. Renee Good is dead. The media wants you to believe she was an innocent bystander, a concerned mother, a poet who was simply documenting federal overreach. They've turned her into a martyr, a symbol of everything supposedly wrong with immigration enforcement under this administration. But here's what they're not telling you. Renee Good wasn't a bystander. She wasn't documenting. She wasn't accidentally caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a trained obstructionist who deliberately positioned her vehicle to block federal agents who ignored repeated commands to move, who accelerated her car towards a federal agent after being told by her companion to drive, baby, drive. Renee Good is dead because she was indoctrinated by the radical left into believing that federal law enforcement was illegitimate, that ICE agents were the enemy, that she had the right and the duty to physically interfere with a federal operation targeting convicted criminals. She's a victim, but she's not a victim of Agent Jonathan Ross, or ICE, or this administration's enforcement policies. She's a victim of Democratic socialists in Minneapolis who spent years telling her that resistance was righteous, that federal agents were villains, that when rule of law didn't apply, when it conflicted with progressive ideology, they radicalized her. They sent her to that roadblock. They filled her head with lies about what ICE was doing and who they were targeting. And when she died, as a direct result of acting on those lies, those same politicians and activists immediately began using her death to attack the very law enforcement she was obstructing. This is the story of how the left creates martyrs. This is the story of indoctrination, radicalization, and the deadly consequences of political rhetoric divorced from reality. This is the story of Renee Good, and it's a warning about what happens when ideology trumps law. To understand what happened on that street in Minneapolis, you need to understand why federal agents were there in the first place. This wasn't a random sweep. This wasn't agents going door to door checking papers. This was Operation Metro Surge, one of the largest federal law enforcement operations in recent history. And it was necessary because Minneapolis had become ground zero for the biggest welfare fraud scheme in American history. 2,000 federal agents deployed to the Twin Cities. These aren't regular patrol officers. We're talking about elite special response teams, the kind of agents deployed when you're dealing with dangerous criminals who might be armed, who might resist, who represent a genuine threat to public safety. Why that level of force? Because this operation was targeting a $9 billion criminal fraud network. $9 billion stolen from the American taxpayers through a systematic, organized scheme that funneled money through fake child care centers, fraudulent claims, and a web of corruption that stretched from Minneapolis to overseas terrorist organizations. Let me say that again so it sinks in. $9 billion in welfare fraud. The largest such scheme in United States history. And it was operating openly, brazenly, for years under the protection of Governor Tampon Timmy Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who had turned their jurisdictions into sanctuary zones where federal law was treated as optional. The money wasn't going to feed hungry children in Minnesota. It was going to luxury cars, to mansions, to overseas bank accounts. Significant portions of it were being funneled to Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization operating in Somalia. Your tax dollars, money that was supposed to help vulnerable American kids, was funding Islamic extremists in East Africa. And the local government knew. They had to know. You don't run a $9 billion fraud operation without leaving traces. You don't process that many fake claims without someone noticing the patterns. But Walz and Frey had made a political calculation. Acknowledging the fraud would mean acknowledging that their sanctuary policies were being exploited. It would mean admitting that their compassionate, progressive approach to immigration and social services had created a paradise for criminals. So they looked the other way. They ignored the red flags. They attacked anyone who raised questions as racist or Islamophobic. And the fraud continued year after year, growing larger and more brazen, while legitimate Americans who needed help were denied resources because the system was being drained by organized theft. That's why Operation Metro Surge was necessary. That's why 2,000 federal agents showed up. Because the local government had completely failed in its duty to protect taxpayers and enforce the law. But the operation wasn't just about fraud. It was also targeting some of the most dangerous criminals living illegally in the United States. People who should never have been allowed into this country in the first place. People who had already been convicted of serious crimes. People who represented an ongoing threat to public safety. Let me give you a specific example. Mahad Abdul Qadir Yusuf. I don't know if I said it right. Frankly, I don't give a fuck. Convicted child predator. This man sexually assaulted a minor, was prosecuted and convicted in an American court, and then was supposed to be deported, but he wasn't. He was still in Minneapolis, still free to walk the streets, still a danger to children. Why? Because local sanctuary policies prevented cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. Because progressive politicians had decided that protecting illegal aliens, even convicted felons, was more important than protecting American children. Yusuf is exactly the kind of person Operation Metro Surge was designed to remove. Not someone's grandmother who overstayed a visa. Not a worker who entered illegally to find a better life. A convicted child predator who had exhausted every legal avenue and who had been ordered removed by a federal immigration judge. This is who the federal agents were there to arrest. Fraudsters. who stole billions, gang members involved in trafficking, convicted sex offenders, the worst of the worst, criminals who local authorities were either unwilling or unable to deal with. And when federal agents showed up to finally enforce the law, to finally hold these people accountable, to finally protect the American people from predators that sanctuary policies had been shielding, they encountered resistance. Not from the criminals, though that happened too, but from radicalized civilians who had been taught that ICE agents were the real criminals, that immigration enforcement was illegitimate, that physically interfering with federal operations was an act of heroism. That's the context. That's what's happening in Minnesota. When Renee Good made the decision that ended her life, the federal government was conducting a massive, necessary operation to dismantle a criminal network and remove dangerous felons. Local politicians were attacking that operation as racist and fascist, and civilians were being mobilized to obstruct federal agents in the field. The stage was set for tragedy. And the people responsible for setting that stage are the ones who radicalized Renee Good into believing that what she was about to do was righteous. The media had worked very hard to paint a specific picture of Renee Good. They call her a mother, a poet, a concerned citizen. They show photos of her smiling with her family. They interview friends who talk about how caring she was, how passionate about justice, how she just wanted to make the world better. All of that might be true. She probably was a caring mother. She might have written poetry. She might have genuinely believed she was fighting for justice. But none of that changes what she actually was in the moment she died. A trained obstructionist who had been radicalized by the left into believing she had the right to physically interfere with the federal law enforcement. Let's talk about her actual involvement with the resistance movement in Minneapolis. Renee Good wasn't just some random person who happened to be nearby when ICE showed up. She was connected to ICE Watch, a network of activists who organized specifically to monitor, harass, and disrupt federal immigration enforcement operations. ICE Watch groups operate in cities across the country. Their stated purpose is to document ICE activities and alert community members when enforcement actions are happening. Their actual purpose is to interfere with those operations. They follow ICE vehicles. They show up at arrest sites. They block roads. They create chaos and obstruction that makes it harder for agents to do their job safely. And they train people to do this. They teach civilians tactical techniques for interfering with law enforcement while trying to avoid prosecution. They provide legal support for people who get arrested. They create networks of like-minded activists who reinforce each other's belief that what they're doing is heroic resistance rather than criminal obstruction. Renee Good was part of that network. She didn't accidentally find herself in front of federal agents. She was there because the ICE Watch network had alerted her that an operation was happening. She drove to the location specifically to interfere. She positioned her vehicle specifically to create an obstacle. Everything she did was deliberate, premeditated, and tactical. Now let's talk about how she got to that point. How does a stay-at-home mother and amateur poet become someone willing to use her vehicle as a weapon against federal agents? Indoctrination? Years of it. Systematic, relentless, effective. Start with the political environment in Minneapolis. This is a city that has been controlled by progressive Democrats for decades. The rhetoric from local leaders isn't just liberal, it's radical. Domestic socialism isn't a fringe position in Minneapolis politics. It's mainstream. Politicians openly campaign on defunding the police, abolishing ICE, creating sanctuary policies, fundamentally transforming America's relationship with immigration and law enforcement. Renee Good was immersed in that environment. She heard city council members call ICE agents fascist. She heard Mayor Jacob Fry declare Minneapolis a sanctuary city and promise to resist federal immigration enforcement. She heard Governor Tim Walz attack the federal government for trying to enforce immigration law. She heard Ilhan Omar, her congressional representative, describe ICE as a terrorist organization that should be abolished. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the message was consistent. Federal immigration enforcement is evil. ICE agents are the enemy. Resistance is not just acceptable, but morally required. Then, layer on the social environment. Her child attended a social justice charter school, not just a regular public school focused on education. A charter school explicitly dedicated to teaching social justice ideology. These schools don't just teach kids to read and do math. They teach them that America is fundamentally racist, that law enforcement exists to oppress minorities, that traditional American values are tools of white supremacy. The parents of kids in these schools tend to be deeply involved in the ideology. They attend meetings, they participate in activism, they reinforce the lessons at home. The entire community becomes an echo chamber where everyone believes the same things, where questioning the narrative is treated as betrayal, where radicalism is normalized. Renee Good's social circle, her child's school, her political representatives, her media diet, probably even her church if she attended a progressive congregation, all of it was telling her the same story. ICE is evil. Immigration enforcement is racist. The federal government under a Republican administration is fascist. Resistance is righteous. This is how you radicalize, or this is how radicalization works. You don't wake up one day and decide to attack federal agents. You're slowly conditioned over time to see them as the enemy, to see yourself as part of a resistance movement, to believe that extreme actions are justified by extreme circumstances. The left in Minneapolis created the perfect environment for this radicalization. They provided the ideology, the community, the reinforcement, the tactical training through groups like Ice Watch, and the assurance that anyone who got in trouble for resisting would be supported, defended, and celebrated as a hero. Renee Good believed she was doing the right thing. She believed the federal agents were illegitimate. She believed she had the moral authority to interfere with their operation. She believed the law didn't apply to her because the law itself was unjust. And she believed all of that because the Democratic Socialists running Minneapolis spent years teaching her to believe it. The media wants to paint her as an innocent victim of federal aggression. But the truth is she was a victim of left-wing indoctrination that convinced her to commit felony obstruction of justice in the deluded belief that she was fighting tyranny. She didn't write that script herself. Tim Walz wrote it. Jacob Fry wrote it. Elon Omar wrote it. The Ice Watch organizers wrote it. The social justice educators wrote it. The progressive activists wrote it. And Renee Good acted it out all the way to its tragic conclusion. Now let's talk about what actually happened on Portland Avenue that day. Not the sanitized version the media is pushing, not the emotional narrative about a mother being gunned down by heartless federal agents, the actual tactical reality of what Renee Good did and why it resulted in her death. The Department of Homeland Security has surveillance footage. They have body cam footage. They have multiple angles showing exactly what happened. And what that footage shows is premeditated obstruction followed by an act of vehicular aggression that left Agent Jonathan Ross with no choice but to respond with lethal force. Renee Good didn't just happen to be in the area. The surveillance shows her maroon Honda Pilot following ICE vehicles for several minutes before the incident. She was tracking them, monitoring their movements, waiting for an opportunity to interfere. When the federal agents completed an arrest and began transporting the subject to a secure facility, Renee Good saw her moment. She accelerated ahead of the ICE convoy and positioned her vehicle diagonally across Portland Avenue, deliberately blocking the roadway. This wasn't a parking mistake. This wasn't someone who got confused about where they were allowed to stop. This was a tactical maneuver designed to prevent federal agents from moving their prisoner. She created a physical barrier with a multi-ton vehicle. The agents immediately recognized what was happening. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered obstruction from radicalized civilians. They've been trained on how to handle this situation. They approached the vehicle, they identified themselves as federal agents, and they gave clear, direct, loud orders. Get out of the car. Not a request, not a suggestion, a lawful order from federal agents conducting an enforcement operation. Renee Good's response is captured on audio. That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you. Think about that response. A federal agent is ordering you to move your vehicle immediately and you respond like you're having a casual conversation. Like, this is a negotiation between equals. Like, you have the option to comply or not based on how you feel about it. That response tells you everything about her mindset. She didn't fear the agents. She didn't respect their authority. She didn't understand that she was committing a federal crime. She genuinely believed that her ideology, her sense of moral righteousness, gave her the right to ignore a lawful order from federal law enforcement. The agents repeated the order multiple times. Louder, more insistent. Get out of the car. Move the vehicle. You are obstructing a federal operation. And here's where it gets critical. Renee Good wasn't alone in the vehicle. She had a companion, another activist named Rebecca Good, nicknamed Becca. And as the agents were ordering them to move, as the situation was escalating, Becca made the choice that sealed Renee's fate. She taunted the agents, "Go get some lunch, big boy," mocking federal agents who are trying to safely transport a prisoner. Treating a serious law enforcement situation like it's a joke. Like it's a game where the worst that can happen is you get your phone video liked and shared on social media. And then, the fatal command. Becca Good looked at Renee and said 3 words. "Drive, baby, drive." And Renee Good hit the gas. The vehicle accelerated toward Agent Jonathan Ross, a multi-ton weapon moving toward a federal officer, and Agent Ross had approximately 1 second to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Here's what you need to understand about Agent Ross. 6 months before this incident, he was the victim of a vehicular assault. During a different enforcement operation, a suspect tried to flee by running him over. Agent Ross was dragged more than 100 yards by that vehicle. He suffered serious injuries. He knows exactly what it feels like to be targeted with a car as a weapon. When you've experienced that trauma, when you've been dragged across the pavement while someone tries to escape by killing you, your threat assessment changes. You don't have the luxury of assuming the best. You don't get to wait and see if the driver is really going to hit you or if they're going to stop at the last second. You respond to the threat with the tools and the training that you have. Agent Ross saw a vehicle accelerating toward him. Based on his experience, his training, and the immediate tactical situation, he assessed it as a lethal threat. He responded accordingly. He fired. Renee Good was struck. She died from her injuries. And in that moment, every Democratic Socialist politician and activist in Minnesota had exactly what they wanted. A martyr. A symbol. A dead civilian they could use to attack ICE and federal immigration enforcement. But let's be absolutely clear about what happened here. This wasn't murder. This wasn't federal agents gunning down an innocent bystander. This was the predictable, inevitable result of radicalization of a civilian using her vehicle as a weapon against a federal officer. Renee Good made a series of choices. She chose to follow ICE vehicles. She chose to block the roadway. She chose to ignore repeated lawful orders. She chose to accelerate her vehicle towards an agent. Every single one of those choices was hers. Every single one of them was illegal. And the final choice, the acceleration, was the one that made lethal force not just justified, but necessary. Agent Ross didn't want to shoot her. No law enforcement officer wants to use lethal force. It's the worst day of their career, even when it's completely justified. But he didn't have a choice. She made the choice for him when she turned her vehicle into a weapon. The left wants to ignore all of this. They want to focus on the fact that she was a mother, that she was unarmed in the traditional sense, that she was just trying to document federal overreach. They want to make this about ICE being out of control, about federal agents being too quick to use force, about the need to abolish immigration enforcement. But none of that changes the tactical reality. A civilian deliberately obstructed a federal operation. She was given multiple opportunities to comply. She was warned. She was ordered to move. And instead of complying, she accelerated her vehicle toward an agent who had every reason to believe he was about to be run over. This is what the left calls finding out. They spent years telling people to resist. They spent years calling ICE illegitimate. They've spent years training civilians to obstruct federal operations. And now they're shocked? Shocked that resistance has consequences? Renee Good found out. And the people who put her in that position, who filled her head with lies about federal agents, who convinced her that obstruction was heroic, who told her to drive, baby, drive, they're the ones with blood on their hands. The Democratic Party owns Renee Good's death. Not Agent Ross, not ICE, not the federal government. The Democratic Socialists who have controlled Minneapolis for decades, who radicalized civilians into believing that federal law enforcement is illegitimate, who created networks to obstruct ICE, who provided the ideology that and the tactical training and the moral justification for what Renee Good did that day. They killed her as surely as if they put the gun in Agent Ross's hand and forced him to pull the trigger. Let me explain why. When you spend years telling people that ICE is evil, that immigration enforcement is racist, that federal agents are fascists who are rounding up innocent families, you create a permission structure for resistance. You're not just criticizing policy, you're delegitimizing the very concept of immigration law enforcement. When you tell people that resistance is not just acceptable, but morally required, when you celebrate people who obstruct federal operations as heroes, when you provide legal support and community reinforcement for people who commit crimes in the name of social justice, you're radicalizing them. And when those radicalized people act on the beliefs you've instilled in them, when they physically interfere with federal agents, when they use their vehicles as weapons, when they get shot because they've been taught that federal authority is illegitimate, you don't get to pretend you had nothing to do with it. Tim Walz told Renee Good that ICE was the enemy. Jacob Fry told her that Minneapolis was a sanctuary where federal immigration law didn't apply. Ilhan Omar told her that ICE is a terrorist organization. The ICE Watch organizers told her how to monitor and disrupt federal operations. Her social justice activist friends told her she was a hero for resisting. Every single one of them bears responsibility for what happened on Portland Avenue. But here's what makes it even worse. The moment Renee Good died, those same people immediately began using her death to attack the very law enforcement she was obstructing. They didn't pause to consider their role in radicalizing her. They didn't question whether their rhetoric had consequences. They didn't acknowledge that telling people to resist federal agents might lead to exactly this kind of tragedy. Instead, these SOBs, they doubled down. They called for investigations. They demanded accountability from ICE. They organized protests. They pushed the narrative that Renee Good was murdered by out-of-control federal agents. They turned her into a martyr for their cause, just like they did to that piece of shit, George Floyd. And in doing so, they're setting up the next Renee Good. They're radicalizing the next civilian who's going to believe that interfering with federal operations is righteous. They're creating the conditions for the next tragedy. This has to be said clearly and without apology. Renee Good is not a martyr. A martyr dies for something real and valuable. Renee Good died for a lie. She died because she was indoctrinated into believing that federal agents were executing lawful warrants were the bad guys, that convicted criminals and welfare fraudsters were the victims, that she had the right and the duty to physically obstruct justice. She's a victim of the Democratic Party's radicalization campaign, a victim of years of anti-ICE propaganda, a victim of the echo chamber that convinced her that resistance was heroic rather than criminal. Let's talk about Agent Rice's perspective for a moment. This man has spent his career trying to protect Americans. He's been injured in the line of duty. He's faced down dangerous criminals. He's done everything by the book. Everything according to his training. Everything according to the law. And on that day, he was doing his job. He was part of an operation to remove a convicted criminal from American soil. He wasn't harassing random immigrants. He wasn't separating families down at the border. He was enforcing a removal order issued by a federal judge against someone who had been convicted of serious crimes. When Renee Good blocked the road, he didn't immediately use force. He gave orders. He attempted to resolve the situation peacefully. He followed protocol. When she accelerated her vehicle toward him, he had a fraction of a second to decide whether he was about to be killed or seriously injured by someone using a car as a weapon. Based on his training and his experience as a victim of a previous vehicular assault, he responded with lethal force. He followed the law. She broke it. He did his duty. She committed a felony. He protected himself and his team. She weaponized her vehicle. And now he's being investigated, questioned, second-guessed, and condemned by the people who have never been in that situation, who have never had to make that decision, who have never faced the possibility of being run over by a radicalized civilian who believes federal authority is illegitimate. This is thanks. This is the thanks federal agents get for trying to enforce the law in a city where local politicians have spent years undermining their authority and radicalizing civilians against them. The vindication of this administration's approach couldn't be clearer. Operation Metro Surge was necessary. The criminals and fraudsters it's targeting need to be removed. And the violence, the obstruction, the resistance is coming exclusively from the left. Every bit of violence in this operation has been initiated by people opposing it. The gang members in Portland who tried to run over federal agents, the radicalized civilians in Minneapolis who block roads and create chaos, the activists who form human shields around convicted predators. Federal agents aren't instigating violence. They're responding to it. They're defending themselves from people who've been taught that resisting federal authority is heroic. And until the left stops radicalizing people into believing that lie, until they stop treating federal law enforcement as illegitimate, until they stop pushing the narrative that ICE agents are fascists and resistance is righteous, more people are going to die. More Renee Goods are going to follow ICE vehicles. More radicalized civilians are going to block roads and ignore lawful orders. More people are going to accelerate their vehicles toward federal agents. And more Agent Rosses are going to have to make the terrible decision to use lethal force to protect themselves. The blood is on the hands of the Democratic Socialists who created this situation. And until they're held accountable for the consequences of their rhetoric, the cycle will continue. What happened in Minneapolis isn't isolated. It's part of a national pattern of resistance and violence against federal immigration enforcement. And that pattern is escalating because the left continues to radicalize people into believing that obstruction is righteous. Look at Portland, Oregon. January 8th, a couple days ago, just days after the Minneapolis incident that killed Renee Good, federal agents conducted a targeted traffic stop of two individuals with warrants, both Venezuelan nationals, both here illegally, both confirmed members of Tren de Aragua, one of the most violent transnational gangs in the Western Hemisphere. Both connected to a prostitution ring that the Department of Homeland Security was linked to human trafficking. These weren't random immigrants trying to find work. These were criminal gang members involved in the exploitation of women and girls. These were exactly the people that immigration enforcement exists to remove from American communities. When federal agents approached their vehicle and ordered them to comply, what did they do? The same thing Renee Good did. They weaponized their vehicle. They tried to run over the agents. And just like in Minneapolis, the agents responded with lethal force. The one was shot in the arm, the other was shot in the chest. Both survived. Both are in federal custody. Both are facing justice. But here's the key point. These incidents are connected. The drive baby drive mentality that got Renee Good killed in Minneapolis is spreading. Criminals and radicalized civilians alike are learning that vehicular assault is a tactic they can use against federal agents. And they're learning it because the left keeps teaching it. Every time they celebrate resistance, every time they attack ICE for defending themselves, every time they treat federal agents as the villains and the people obstructing them as heroes, they're sending a message: resist, obstruct, attack if you have to, and we'll support you. The Portland gang members saw what happened in Minneapolis. They saw the media coverage. They saw the protests. They saw the politicians condemning ICE. And they calculated that maybe, just maybe, if they tried to run over federal agents, those agents would hesitate. Maybe the fear of political backlash would make them hold their fire. Maybe they could escape. They were wrong. Just like Renee Good. But the fact that they tried tells you everything about what the left's rhetoric is producing. Here's the inevitable conclusion that everyone needs to understand. If the left continues to call for resistance, if they continue to delegitimize federal immigration enforcement, if they continue to radicalize civilians into believing that obstruction is heroic, more people are going to die. More Renee Goods are going to block roads and ignore lawful orders. More gang members are going to try to run over agents. More federal officers are going to be forced to use lethal force to protect themselves. And every single one of those incidents will be the fault of the politicians and activists who created the environment where this happens. The responsibility lies with Ilhan Omar, who calls ICE a terrorist organization and demands its abolition, with Jacob Fry, who declared Minneapolis a sanctuary and promised to resist federal enforcement, with Tim Walz, who enabled $9 billion in fraud and attacked federal agents for trying to clean it up, with every activist, every organizer, every social justice educator who taught people that federal authority is illegitimate. They own this. Every death, every injury, every violent confrontation, it's the direct, predictable result of their rhetoric. And here's what they don't acknowledge. None of this had to happen. Renee Good would still be alive today if she simply moved her vehicle when ordered. The Portland gang members would be in custody without anyone being shot if they simply complied with the traffic stop. Every violent incident in Operation Metro Surge could have been avoided if people just followed the law. But The left has convinced people that the law doesn't apply when they disagree with it. They've created a culture where federal authority is optional, where resistance is celebrated, where compliance is treated as cowardice or collaboration. And now people are dying because of it. The federal agents aren't the problem. They're doing their jobs, enforcing the law, removing criminals and welfare fraudsters from American communities. They're not randomly targeting anyone. They're executing warrants issued by federal judges against people who've been convicted of crimes or who've exhausted all legal avenues to remain in the country. The problem is the resistance, the obstruction, the radicalized civilians and criminals who've been taught that federal enforcement is illegitimate and that violence is an acceptable response. Until that changes, until the left stops radicalizing people, until they acknowledge that their rhetoric has deadly consequences, this pattern will continue. More cities, more confrontations, more violence, more deaths. And all of it is preventable. All of it. The direct result of a political movement that values ideology over the rule of law, that celebrates resistance over compliance, that treats federal agents as the enemy rather than people obstructing them. There's no middle ground when it comes to a federal order. There's no negotiation. There's no option to comply based on whether you agree with the policy or like the agents or think the law is just. When a federal agent gives you a lawful order, you comply, period. Not because the agents are perfect, not because every law is just, not because the system never makes mistakes, but because we are a nation of laws, and laws only have a meaning if they're enforced. The alternative to the rule of law is chaos. It's everyone deciding for themselves which laws they'll follow and which they'll ignore. It's vigilante justice and mob rule. It's the strong preying on the weak without consequence. It's the collapse of civilization into tribal warfare where might makes right. Renee Good didn't understand this. She'd been taught that federal immigration law was illegitimate, that she had the moral authority to judge which laws deserved to be followed, that resistance to unjust authority was heroic. She was wrong, and the error in judgment cost her her life. But she's not the villain in this story. She's a victim. The villains are the people who radicalized her, who convinced her that what she was doing was righteous, who sent her to that roadblock with the delusion that she was fighting tyranny rather than committing a felony. Tim Walz, Jacob Fry, Ilhan Omar, the Ice Watch organizers, the social justice activists, the educators who taught her ideology instead of civic literacy, every single person who contributed to creating the environment where a stay-at-home mother and a poet believed that using her vehicle as a weapon against federal agents was an act of resistance rather than an act of aggression. They're the ones who should be investigated. they're the ones who should be held accountable. Because Renee Good is dead because of what they taught her to believe. The message to Minneapolis needs to be crystal clear. The federal agents aren't leaving. Operation Metro Surge will continue until the $9 billion in fraud is fully accounted for and the criminals who stole it are prosecuted. The convicted predators like Mahad Abdul-Qadir Yusuf will be removed. The gang members involved in trafficking will be arrested. The welfare fraudsters will face justice. And if you choose to stand in the way, if you choose to obstruct federal operations, if you choose to weaponize your vehicle against agents executing lawful warrants, you are choosing the consequences that follow. Not because the agents are cruel or out of control, but because the federal law enforcement has a job to do. And that job doesn't stop because radicalized citizens decide to interfere. You can stand with the agents who are trying to protect Americans from criminals and fraudsters, or you can stand with the agitators who are protecting convicted predators and welfare thieves. You can support the Constitution and the rule of law, or you can support the resistance that believes laws are optional when they conflict with progressive ideology. But you can't do both. And you need to understand that your choice has consequences. Renee Good made her choice. She chose to believe the lies. She chose to obstruct federal agents. She chose to accelerate her vehicle toward Agent Ross. And she paid for that choice with her life. Don't make the same mistake. Don't let the left radicalize you into believing that federal authority is illegitimate. Don't fall for the lie that resistance is heroic. Don't sacrifice yourself for politicians who will use your death as propaganda. And then move on to the next martyr. The rule of law is absolute. It applies to everyone. And when federal agents give you a lawful order, you comply. That's not tyranny. That's civilization. And it's worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you disagree with specific policies. Even when the alternative looks appealing to people who have been taught to hate their own country. Stand with the law. Stand with the agents. Stand with America. The resistance offers nothing but chaos, violence, and death. We're done here.